Merrick taught 40 children their letters in a one-room schoolhouse in Cottonwood Bend, out in Ford County, Kansas, and when the seed company's man came to town, he told her to keep her nose out of the grown folks' paper. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She just asked, real polite, if she might borrow the county's copy to read. That was the first time. The second time was at the feed store, in front of 11 farmers with dust on their boots and worry in their faces. The agent, a smooth fellow named Royce Tolliver, patted the contract flat on the counter and smiled at her like she was one of her own pupils. "Ma'am," he said, "you teach the little ones their letters. Leave the big words to men who make a living by them." The men laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh, but they laughed. That night she lit her father's lamp. She took out his old reading glass, the one with the brass rim worn smooth. And she turned to the clause printed smaller than all the rest. The one line no man in that whole county had read clear to the bottom. If you believe quiet people read the fine print, this story is for you. Before we go on, do something for me. Subscribe to the channel, and down in the comments, tell me the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. A school teacher in Kansas, and a room full of people who thought she couldn't read. Let's see how many towns are listening. Now let me tell you how it started. It was spring of 1934, and Cottonwood Bend was dying by inches. 3 dry years, one right after the other. The rain had gone somewhere else and forgotten the way back. The wheat came up thin and yellow, or it didn't come up at all. Wind pulled the topsoil right off the fields and carried it east in brown clouds that turned noon into dusk. You'd wipe the table and it'd be gritty again before supper. You'd cough up mud you couldn't remember breathing. The bank in Dodge held paper on nearly every farm within 20 miles. Mortgages had gone sour. Notes were coming due that no honest crop could ever pay. Men who'd never begged for a thing in their lives lay awake at night doing arithmetic that never came out right. And the children came to school hungry. Ada saw it every morning. She'd ring the bell and they'd file in, some of them barefoot to save the shoes, some of them with faces a little too sharp at the cheekbone. She kept a tin of crackers in her desk and handed them out like she was just being generous, not because a boy hadn't eaten since the day before. She was 34 years old, and she was a widow. Her husband had passed 4 winters back, a fever that took him quick. She had no children of her own. So she took 40 of them and called them hers, and nobody ever heard her complain of the load. She bought their slate pencils herself, out of a teacher's wage that was late as often as not. When the Pruitt baby ran a fever the whole town thought would carry her off, it was Ada who sat up 3 nights running, sponging that little forehead, not sleeping, not leaving. The baby lived. Emmett Pruitt never forgot it. Neither did his wife. That was the kind of woman she was. Steady, plain-spoken. The town loved her the way you love a thing you count on without thinking. Like the sun coming up. You don't praise it, you just know it'll be there. On her desk, right beside the inkwell, sat her father's reading glass. Brass rim, a good thick lens, a little scratched at one edge. The children thought it was for looking at bugs, and she let them think it. She'd pick it up sometimes when she was checking their sums, hold it over a smudged slate. And the numbers would jump up big and clear. It was just a keepsake. Just her father's old glass, come down to her when he passed. Nobody in Cottonwood Bend gave it a second thought. Neither did she, not yet. Then the clean Ford came into town. It rolled down Main Street on a Tuesday, and it was so clean it hurt to look at. In a county where every vehicle wore a coat of dust like a second skin, this one shone. It stopped in front of the feed store, and out stepped Royce Tolliver. He was a man in his 40s, well-fed, in a suit that had never seen a field. He had a way of smiling that reached his mouth and stopped there. He shook every hand he could reach. He remembered names. He asked after a man's wife by her first name, though he'd only heard it once. He was, folks agreed later, about the friendliest man ever to come to Cottonwood Bend. He worked for the Halloran Seed Grain Company. And he had come, he said, to save the county. He set up at the feed store with a stack of papers and a fountain pen and a leather case, and the offer he laid out was the kind of thing a desperate man dreams about. $410. That was the number. $410 in certified wheat seed, good seed, clean seed. The kind that might actually take root and give a crop. And credit on top of it. Credit for the plowing, for the fuel, for the little things a farm eats up before it ever gives back. All of it advanced now, against the coming harvest. Easy terms, he said. The easiest terms a man ever heard. You could see what it did to them. To men who'd been staring at a ruined spring with empty seed bins, here was salvation walking down Main Street in a clean suit. $410. Seed in the ground. A chance. Now, there's no time to dawdle, Tolliver told them, and he said it kind, like a doctor. The company can only extend this to so many, and planting won't wait on us. I'll need every man's mark inside 9 days. 9 days, gentlemen, and then the offer closes and I move on to the next county. I'd hate for a neighbor to go without because the fellow next to him was slow to see his own good. 9 days. He hung that number in the air like a bell. And the men started coming. One at a time at first, then in twos and threes, to the feed store counter where Tolliver sat with his pen. Ada heard about it the way she heard about everything, from the children. A girl named Ruth told her, proud, that her daddy was going to get new seed from the seed man and there'd be a real crop this year. Ada smiled at her and said that was fine news. And it was, or it should have been. But something in it caught at her. She couldn't have told you what, only that a stranger who smiled that much and pushed that hard on a 9-day clock had learned to smile and push somewhere, from someone, for a reason. She'd known a few men in her life who did their best work fast, before you had time to think. Her father used to say it plain. A contract that can't wait a week, can't stand a week's reading. So she walked down to the feed store one afternoon after school let out. Tolliver was there at his counter, papers squared, pen at his elbow. A couple of farmers stood by. Ada came up polite, her hands folded, and she asked if she might look at the contract. Just to read it. She said she liked to understand a thing before her neighbors put their names to it. He handed her a copy without much thought, still talking to the men beside him. And Ada stood there and read. She read the way she'd been taught long ago, slow, with her finger moving under the lines, taking each word for what it actually said and not what it seemed to say in a hurry. Most of it was plain enough. The advance, the seed, the repayment against harvest. And then she came to a line near the fold, a line about the yield, and it was worded strange, turned around. It talked about a harvest below the stated bushel, and about the crop passing somewhere, and the words got tangled in a way that plain words don't tangle by accident. She looked up. "Mr. Tolliver," she said, "this line here, about a short harvest. What does it mean exactly? If the crop comes up small, and in these 3 years, sir, they all have. What happens to it under this?" The talk at the counter stopped. Tolliver turned to her, and the smile was still there, but it had gone flat. He looked at her the way a man looks at a fence that's in his road. "That's a standard term, ma'am," he said. "Every contract's got its standard terms. You needn't trouble your head over it. I'd like to understand it, all the same," Ada said. "If you'd just tell me what it means when the harvest is short." And here is where he made his first mistake, though he didn't know it and wouldn't for 9 days. He reached over and took the paper right out of her hands. Gentle, smiling, but he took it. "Miss Merrick," he said, "this is grown folks' paper. Business between the company and the men who farm. You've got your schoolhouse and your little ones, and God bless you for it. Leave this to the folks it concerns." And he set the contract back on his stack, out of her reach, and turned back to the farmers like she'd already left. The men shifted their feet. One of them looked at the floor. Nobody spoke up for her. Ada didn't color. She didn't sputter. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Tolliver," in that same even voice, and she turned and walked out. But she'd read the line. She'd read enough of it. and walking home, past the fields with the wind combing the dead grass flat. She did a thing that a lifetime ago she'd been trained to do without thinking. She took the little tablet she carried for the children's marks, and she wrote the question down. The exact words of it. The date. What he'd said. Grown folks paper. She wrote that down too. She didn't know yet why. It was just habit, a habit from a life she hardly thought about anymore. You write down what a man won't answer. Someday the answer matters. She got home and made her supper and didn't sleep well. The next day after school, she went to see Emmett Pruitt. The Pruitt place was 2 miles out, and it wore its trouble openly. The barn needed paint it would never get. The fences sagged. Emmett was in the yard, a lean man gone leaner. Mending harness he probably wouldn't have a horse to use much longer. His wife, Nell, came to the door with the baby that Ada had nursed through the fever, a healthy little thing now, God be thanked, and that was about the only healthy thing on the whole farm. Ada visited a while, asked after the child. Then she came around to it easy, the way you do. She said the seed man was in town, and everybody was signing his paper, and she'd tried to read it and gotten turned around on one line, and hadn't Emmett signed something like it last season? Something went across Emmett Pruitt's face. Ada saw it and filed it away. I signed, he said. Just that. Would you let me look at your copy? Ada asked. Just to compare. I like to understand a thing. You know how I am. Emmett went inside a long while. When he came back, he had a folded paper gone soft at the creases, and he handed it over like it burned him. Ada opened it on the porch rail. It was the same contract. The Halloran contract, last year's, with Emmett's name signed at the bottom in a careful hand. And she read it through, and she came to that same strange line near the fold. And there, in his copy, she could see it plain. The whole clause about the short harvest was set in type a size smaller than everything around it, not much. You'd never notice unless you were the kind of person who noticed. A hair smaller. Tucked at the fold, where a paper naturally wants to close on itself and hide what's printed there. She held it up, turned it to the light. Smaller type. At the fold. On purpose. Ada, Emmett said, and his voice was low. You'd best give that back. She looked at him. There was something in the man she wanted to ask about, something raw, but the porch wasn't the place and his wife was in the doorway. So she folded it back along its soft creases. Thank you, Emmett, she said, and she made to hand it to him. But he shook his head, quick, like the thing scared him. Keep it a day if you want, he said. Just don't let Tolliver know you've got it. Please, just don't let him know. That was a strange thing to say. Ada tucked the paper away in her satchel and let it be. Just a paper to compare. Smaller type at the fold. She set it in her mind alongside the question she'd written down, and she rode home. And if you'd been watching, you'd have said she'd already half forgotten it, the way a person sets a thing on a shelf and moves on. The audience knows better. That paper wasn't forgotten. It was loaded. By the end of that week, Tolliver's 9 days were running, and the town was in a fever of a different kind. Men who'd hemmed and hawed were coming in to sign. Because the fellow down the road had signed, and nobody wanted to be the last one standing when the offer closed. Fear does that. It moves through a county like the dust does, gets in everything, and it moves men toward a pen faster than any promise could. And it all came to a head, the way these things do, at the feed store on a Saturday, with a crowd. Ada was there for flour and thread. That's all. The store was full, 11 men at least by the count that got told and retold after, gathered near Tolliver's counter, some signing, some watching, the air thick with talk. And Tolliver was in his glory, papers squared, pen going, calling men by their wives' names. There was a man named Kern in the crowd. Silas Kern, the chairman of the Grange, a decent, tired old fellow who'd been carrying the county's troubles on his own shoulders longer than was fair. And there was a young family, the ones who'd fallen furthest behind on their note, and the husband had the pen in his hand right there on the counter, leaning down to sign. His wife beside him with her hand on his sleeve. Ada saw it. And something in her wouldn't hold still. She didn't shout. Understand that. She never shouted. She just spoke up, clear enough to carry the schoolteacher's voice that 40 children obeyed without her ever having to raise it. "Emmett," she said. The room turned. Emmett Pruitt was there by the door, hat in his hands, come in for something and caught now in the light. "Emmett," Ada said again, gentle, but everyone heard it. "You signed this same paper last spring. Would you tell these folks what happened to your wheat last fall?" The store went quiet. That kind of quiet where you can hear a scale creak and a fly on the window. Everyone looked at Emmett Pruitt. And Emmett Pruitt stood there, and his mouth worked, and nothing came out. His face crumpled the way a strong man's face crumples when the thing inside is too big and too shameful to say in a room full of his neighbors. He looked at the young husband with the pen. He looked at Ada. And he couldn't. He just couldn't get a word past whatever was lodged in his throat. And then he turned and walked out. The door banged behind him. Through the window they watched him go down the street fast, not looking back, a man walking away from a wound he couldn't show. Nobody in that store understood exactly what they'd just seen. But every soul in it felt it. Felt that something had happened to Emmett Pruitt under this paper. Something bad enough that a grown man would rather walk out into the street than name it. The young husband straightened up slow. He was still holding the pen. But he'd stopped. That's when Tolliver laughed. He laughed, easy and warm, and he spread his hands like a man among friends, and he shook his head at Ada like she was a child who'd said something too silly to scold. "Now, ma'am," he said, and his voice filled the store. "Ma'am, you teach the little ones their letters, and there's not a one of us don't thank you for it. But leave the big words to men who make a living by them." He turned to the crowd. He was still smiling. Poor Pruitt had a bad year, same as we all did. That's the weather, gentlemen. That's the good Lord and the dry sky. It's got nothing to do with a piece of paper. And the men laughed. They did. Because Tolliver had made it easy to laugh, and laughing was easier than looking too close at Emmett Pruitt's empty place by the door. But it was a poor, thin laugh, and under it every man there was uneasy, and if you'd watched their eyes you'd have seen not one of them was quite as sure as he'd been a minute before. Ada stood very still through the laughing. She let it run out. Then she said, quiet, 2 things. "Mr. Tolliver," he raised his eyebrows, still smiling. "You told me at the schoolhouse to leave your paper alone. And you've told me here, in front of these men, that I ought to leave the big words to my betters." She wasn't angry. That was the strange part. Her voice was as level as a still pond. "I'll remember both. And I expect these gentlemen will too." Then she paid for her flour and her thread and she walked out. And behind her the young husband set the pen down on the counter and said he reckoned he'd sleep on it, and his wife took his arm, and they left. And that was one mark Royce Tolliver did not get that day, and he knew whose fault it was. And the flat thing came back into his eyes as he watched the schoolteacher go. 2 offenses now. The schoolhouse door and the feed store floor. 11 men had heard the second one. The account was open. And an account like that, in a story like this, does not stay open. Ada went home. She fixed a small supper she didn't much eat. And when the dark came down and the wind died the way it sometimes did at nightfall, she did the thing she'd been circling for a week without letting herself know she was circling it. She lit her father's lamp, the good one, the brass one, that she saved for real reading. And she took the 2 papers out of her satchel, Emmett Pruitt's soft, signed copy, and a fresh blank one she'd quietly folded into her purse at the store while Tolliver was busy laughing. And she picked up her father's reading glass. She sat down at the table in the lamplight, with the dust ticking soft against the dark window. And she held that thick brass-rimmed lens over the small type at the fold. The letters swam up big and black and clear. She read the whole clause. every word of it, slow, her lips moving, the way she'd read 100 deeds and contracts in a life she'd almost let herself forget. And there it was. It said, in words wound round to hide their own meaning, that upon any single harvest yielding below the stated bushel, a short harvest, in plain speech, the entire crop, the whole yield of that farm for that year, would pass to the Halloran Seed and Grain Company. Not part of it. All of it. Every bushel that grew. For the sum of $1. $1 and other considerations. That was the phrase. Other considerations. Meaning nothing. Meaning whatever the company said it meant. And the farmer, this was the part that made her set the glass down and put her hand flat on the table, the farmer would still owe the note, the $410, and the credit, and the interest. All of it. He'd hand over his entire crop for a single silver dollar, and he'd walk away still owing every cent of the advance. Ada sat with that a long moment in the lamplight. Because here is the thing about Ford County in the spring of 1934. A short harvest wasn't a risk. It wasn't a maybe. It was 3 years running and no rain in the sky. A short harvest was a certainty. A yield below the stated bushel. Why, there wasn't a farm in the whole county that would clear the stated bushel. Not in this drought. Not if every man prayed on his knees till August. The clause wasn't a clause about a bad year. It was a clause about every year. It was written for exactly this. It was a machine built to take a whole county's crop, farm by farm, for $1 apiece, and leave every family still owing on the debt. That's what had happened to Emmett Pruitt. That's what he couldn't say out loud in the feed store. He'd signed, and the harvest had come up short like it was always going to, and the company had taken every bushel of his wheat for $1 and left him owing the whole advance besides. That's why he'd walked out into the street. Not the weather. The paper. And the shame of having put his own name to it. Ada picked up the reading glass again and read the clause a second time to be sure she hadn't got it wrong. She hadn't. And something changed in her at that table. You could not have seen it from across the room. There was no gasp, no tears, no fist coming down. But the pain of it, the thought of that young husband nearly signing, of the Kern family behind on their note, of 40 children going hungrier still when the crop they were promised was taken out from under them for a silver dollar, the pain of it turned, right there in the lamplight, into something harder and quieter and far more dangerous to Royce Tolliver than any amount of shouting. It turned into resolve. Because Ada Merrick could read. She could read better than any man who'd laughed at her in that store. And she had just read, clear as a slate held up in the morning light, exactly how the Halloran Seed and Grain Company meant to take the bread out of 40 children's mouths. 9 days, Tolliver had said, and some of those days were already gone. She thought about going to him, standing up in the feed store and reading it out and shaming him where he'd shamed her. She let herself feel how good that would be for about the length of one breath. Then she set it aside. That wasn't how you won a thing like this. Her father had taught her that too. You don't warn the man you mean to catch. You let him keep on being sure of himself. You do your work quiet, and you gather your proof, and you pick your ground. So she didn't go to Tolliver. She took out a fresh sheet of paper instead, and in the lamplight, with the reading glass at her elbow, she began, very carefully, in her clean schoolteacher's hand, to copy the clause out word for word, every hidden line of it, big enough this time for anybody to read. There was a soft knock at her door. Ada looked up. It was full dark now, late for a caller. She crossed the room and opened it, and there on the step, hat in his hands, wretched, stood Emmett Pruitt. "Miss Ada," he said. His voice was rough. "I couldn't say it. In the store. In front of everybody. I couldn't get it out." He swallowed hard. "But I can't let those other fellows do what I done. I can't." "Will you?" He stopped. "Started again. You had my paper. You read it, didn't you? You know." Ada stepped back and held the door wide, and the lamplight fell out across him. "I know, Emmett," she said gently. "Come in. Sit down." She glanced at the papers spread on her table, the reading glass, the claws coming clear under her pen. "I know exactly what they did to you. And I think, between the two of us, we might just make sure they never do it to another soul in this county." Emmett Pruitt stood in the doorway a moment longer, this ruined man, and something came up in his eyes that hadn't been there in a year. Then he stepped inside, and Ada shut the door against the dark and the dust, and the lamp burned on late into the Kansas night. 9 days. And Royce Tolliver, asleep in his clean room at the boarding house, certain a schoolteacher couldn't read law, had no idea at all that his clock had just started running the other way. They worked till the lamp guttered low. Emmett sat at her table with his hat in his lap, and Ada laid it all out for him. The blank contract she'd taken at the store. His own soft, creased copy from last year. The fresh sheet where she'd copied the clause big and plain. She showed him the two side by side. She held her father's reading glass over the small print at the fold, and she watched his face change as the letters swam up clear. "There," she said. "You see it now?" Emmett read it twice. His lips moved. When he got to the end, his hand was shaking. $1, he said, for all of it. And I still owed him the $410. He set the glass down like it burned him. "I thought it was the drought took my wheat, Miss Ada. I thought it was God." "It wasn't God. It was that man in the clean Ford." "It was that man," she agreed. "And the company behind him. And a line of type they set a size too small to read." He looked at her then, and there was shame in it, but there was something else too. Something that had been dead in him for a year, sitting up. "What do we do?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. Ada told him. She did not mean to go to Tolliver. That was the thing Emmett kept snagging on, and she had to say it 3 ways before it settled. "You didn't warn the man you meant to catch. You let him keep signing farmers, sure as sunrise, right up to his own meeting. And there, in front of the whole valley, before a single new name went on the dotted line, you read the thing aloud. You let the words do it. You couldn't argue a desperate man out of $400. But you could let him hear, in the plain light of the Grange Hall, exactly what he was about to trade for it. "I'll need your paper," she said. "This one. The signed one. Can you bear to let me stand up and show it?" Emmett Pruitt was quiet a long moment. "You show it," he said. "You show 'em what I done, if it stops the next fool. I don't care who laughs." "Nobody's going to laugh, Emmett." He left near midnight. She watched his lantern go bobbing off down the section road, small and yellow in all that dark. Then she sat back down at her table, and she began to write. She wrote to the county attorney in Dodge. Mr. Alderton. She'd never met the man, but she knew the office, and she knew how to write to it. 6 years she'd known how. She laid out the clause word for word. She named the company. She named the sum. She asked one plain thing, was a term buried in fine type at the fold, undisclosed and unread, good law in the state of Kansas? She copied it fair, folded it, and set it by the door to catch the morning post. Then she wrote to the state Grange office, the same facts, a second copy. 2 lines in the water. If one didn't take, maybe the other would. That was the first night. The 9 days were a strange time. To look at her, nothing had changed. She rang the school bell at 8. She heard the little ones say their letters, and she cut the older boys' arithmetic short so they could get home to the plowing. She kept the tin of crackers in her desk for the children who came without breakfast, and there were more of those every week now. She sat up straight and she smiled, and she gave no sign. But every evening, when the schoolhouse emptied, she went home and she copied. She copied the clause out by hand, big and clear, 1 sheet for every family that might sign. Kern, Alderton wouldn't be back in time to help her. She knew that even as she mailed the letter, so she built her own proof, sheet by sheet. Tied in a bundle with string. She wanted every man in that hall to be able to hold the words in his own 2 hands and read them himself. not take her word. His own eyes. On the third night, Emmett came again, and this time he brought his wife. Nell Pruitt was a thin woman with a tired mouth, and she stood just inside the door twisting her apron, and she said, "I told him he was a fool to sign it. I told him." Her voice cracked. "And then I told him he was a bigger fool to say so. After, I made him keep still. That was me, Miss Ada. I was ashamed for the neighbors to know." She pressed her lips together hard. "You put us up in front of everybody, if it helps. I'll stand there myself." Ada took her hands. They were cold. "You won't have to stand anywhere you don't want to," she said. "Emmett's paper will do the standing." On the fifth night, the near thing happened. She was at the feed store buying thread, and Silas Kern was there, the Grange chairman, a big, slow-tired man who'd carried the valley's troubles on his back for years and had the stoop to prove it. He came over to her at the counter, and he lowered his voice. "Miss Merrick," he said, "that seed man was in here today. Tolliver, asking after Emmett Pruitt's old contract. He watched her carefully. Seems somebody borrowed it and didn't bring it back. He wanted to know who." Ada's heart went still. But her hands didn't stop with the thread. "And what did Mr. Farrow tell him?" she asked. "Told him he didn't rightly recall." Kern almost smiled. "Farrow's got no love for that company. None of us do, if it comes to it. We're just—" He stopped. His big shoulders sagged. "We're just drowning, Miss Merrick. A man'll grab any rope that's thrown him, even a bad one, even one he half suspects." Here was her chance, and she took it. "Mr. Kern," she said, "walk me out." They went out into the dust-brown evening, and she stood him by his wagon, and she asked him a question the way she'd ask a slow boy a sum, not to shame him, only to make him find the answer himself. "You farmed 40 years, she said. "In 3 dry years running, has your wheat once made a full yield? You know it hasn't. Will it this year, with the ground the way it is?" He looked out at the gray fields. "No," he said, "not this year." "Then let me tell you what's in that contract," Ada said, "and you tell me if it's a rope or a noose." And she walked Silas Kern through it, plain, the way she'd walked Emmett. "Sign, and take the 410. Plant, pray, and the first short harvest, which is this harvest, Mr. Kern, this fall, near certain, the whole crop passes to Halloran for $1, every bushel. And you still owe the note. The seed money on your books, and not a grain in your bin to sell against it." Kern was quiet a long time. A muscle worked in his jaw. "For $1, he said at last. "For $1. And other considerations, the paper says. That's a lawyer's way of saying nothing." He took his hat off and turned it in his hands, and when he put it back on his mind was made. "The signing's the 9th, he said. "At the Grange. I run the meeting." He looked at her. "You want the floor, Miss Merrick. You've got the floor. Before a pen touches paper. You have my word." That was the 5th night. She should have felt easy after that, with the chairman himself behind her. She didn't. Because Alderton's letter hadn't come. She'd counted the days like a woman counting coins she didn't have. The post came to Cottonwood Bend 3 times a week, weather willing, and the weather that spring was never willing. A letter to Dodge and an answer back. It was close. It was too close. Every day the mail came without it. The walls of her little house drew in a bit more. On the 6th day, nothing. The 7th, nothing, and a wind out of the southwest that filled the sky with red dirt by noon and stopped the mail wagon 2 miles out with a drift over the road. On the 8th day she nearly gave it up. She sat at her table with her bundle of hand-copied clauses, and she thought, it may just be this. My own hand and Emmett's ruined paper and a chairman's goodwill. It may have to be enough. And she thought about Tolliver's smooth face and how a jury of drowning men might yet decide that a bird in the hand was worth more than a schoolteacher's warning, and her courage went thin as paper. That was the night she told Emmett the last thing about herself. He'd come by to see was there anything more she needed. And he found her low. And being a decent man he saw it, and he said, "You don't have to do this, Miss Ada. You've done enough. Nobody'd fault you." And Ada, tired, said a thing she hadn't meant to say. "I read my first contract when I was 19, Emmett, not a primer. A contract." She smiled a little at his face. "My father was a lawyer, a country lawyer, 2 towns from where I grew up, Sitka Township. Little practice. Deeds and wills and boundary lines. I clerked for him 6 years before I ever taught a day of school. I copied his papers in a fair hand. I read every line he put in front of me, and a good many he didn't. I know how the small type at the fold gets there, and I know why." Her voice steadied as she spoke, the way a voice does when it remembers what it is. Tolliver looked at me and saw a woman who teaches babies their ABCs. He never once thought to ask what I did before. Emmett was staring at her. "You've been reading law since before that man could shave," he said. "Since before he could shave." And she laughed, and it surprised her, and the low mood broke like a fever breaking. She was Amos Merrick's daughter. She'd been raised on the fine print. Let the letter come or not, she knew what she knew, and no smooth man in a clean Ford was going to tell her she couldn't read. The 9th day came up clear and cold. She was at her desk with the morning children when she heard the wagon. She looked up through the dusty window and saw the mail rig coming down the section road, the driver hunched against the wind. And something in her stood straight up and held its breath. She let the children go early. She walked to the store on legs that didn't feel like hers. And Mr. Farrow, behind his counter, held up a long envelope and said, "Come clear from Dodge, Miss Merrick. Reckon it's the one you've been watching for." Her hands weren't quite steady on it. She took it out into the light and opened it there on the store step, and she read it once fast and once slow, and by the second reading she had to put a hand on the doorframe. Mr. Alderton had written back. He wrote as a lawyer writes, careful, no more than he could stand behind. But under the care the thing was iron. A term of that kind, he wrote, a material term, working a forfeiture of the entire crop, set in reduced type and folded out of plain sight, was not conspicuously disclosed as the statute of this state required, and in his opinion would not be enforced by any court in Kansas that read it. And then the line that made her sit down on the store step in front of God and everybody. He had seen this contract before. Halloran Seed Grain, he wrote, had run a contract in all material respects identical through Greer County the previous season. He had a copy of it in his own file. He named it. Same clause, same dollar. A whole season's farm swept for the price of a cup of coffee apiece. It was not one greedy agent. It was the company's way of doing business, county after county, and now it was written down in a county attorney's hand. Ada folded the letter and put it in her satchel with the rest. With Emmett's contract soft at the creases. With his $1 bill that she'd asked him for and he'd given her without a word. With her bundle of hand-copied clauses tied in string. With her tablet of children's marks because a schoolteacher carries that everywhere and it steadied her to have it. Then she went home, and she washed her face, and she waited for dark. The Grange Hall that night was full as she'd ever seen it. Every lamp they had was lit, and still the corners stood in shadow, and the wind threw grit against the windows in long hissing gusts, and the whole valley was packed in on the plank benches. Men she'd taught as boys, women whose babies she'd sat up with. The Kerns. The Pruitts, faces gone thin and hard with 3 years of dust. At the front, at a table, sat Royce Tolliver. He had his ledger open and his good pen out and a neat stack of Halloran contracts squared at his elbow. And he was smiling. He wore a clean collar in a room full of patched shirts. He'd moved his meeting up and thought himself clever for it. And he had no more notion of what was coming than a man has of the step he's about to miss in the dark. Silas Kern stood up and called the meeting, and the room quieted, and Tolliver rose smooth to make his pitch, and Kern said, "Before that, Royce Miss Merrick's asked to say a word to the folks." As is her right, this being a Grange floor. And he sat down. Tolliver's smile stayed on his mouth but went out of his eyes. "Now, Mr. Kern, I don't think we need a lecture from the schoolhouse. You'll wait your turn," Kern said, same as any man. And there was iron in the tired old chairman, too, that night. Ada stood up. She walked to the front, and she felt every eye come onto her, and she set her satchel on the table by Tolliver's neat stack. She took out one of the Halloran contracts, a fresh blank one, the same as the sheaf at his elbow. She took out her father's reading glass, brass-rimmed, thick-lensed, scratched at the one edge, the glass she'd read 1,000 of her father's papers through. And she held it up so the lamplight caught it, and she said, in her clear schoolroom voice, the voice that had taught 40 children their letters, "I'd like to read you all a part of this contract. A part that's printed smaller than the rest, down here, at the fold." She fitted the glass to the small type, where a tired man signing at the end of a long day might not think to look, and she read it aloud. She read the clause word for word, slow, the way she'd have read a hard passage to the older children so the sense couldn't be missed. The forfeiture, the yield below the stated bushel, the whole crop, every grain of it, passing to the Halloran Seed and Grain Company. And then she lowered the glass and looked out at them and told them the price. Plain, for $1, she said, and other considerations. And you'd still owe them the $410. The hall had gone dead quiet, only the wind, hissing at the glass. Ada let it sit a moment. Then she gave them the line she'd been carrying 9 days, and she gave it dry, without heat, the way you say a thing you know needs no help from you. "It's a fine contract," she said. "It doesn't take your land. It only takes every bushel that grows on it, the first year the rain fails." She looked from face to face. And in Ford County, gentlemen, the rain always fails. You could feel it move through the room. A man near the front had a pen already in his hand, halfway to a paper, and he set it down like it had gone hot. Somebody's chair scraped. A low sound went along the benches, not words yet, just the sound a crowd makes when the ground shifts under it. Tolliver was on his feet. He got his smile back on, spread his hands, turned to the room genial and pained. Folks, you're being frightened over a standard term. Every seed contract in the country's got a yield provision. It protects the company's investment. It's boilerplate. This lady means well, I'm sure, but she's got no more business reading a commercial instrument than I've got grading her spelling papers. Then it won't trouble you, Ada said, if I show them what the standard term does. And she reached into her satchel and laid Emmett Pruitt's contract on the table. "This one's not blank," she said. "This one's signed. Emmett Pruitt signed it a year ago, right here, from this same company, this same clause." She set his last fall tally beside it, the thin, ruined figures. His wheat came up short, like everyone's did, and the Halloran Seed and Grain Company took the whole of it. She laid $1 bill on the table, flat, in the lamplight. "For this. He gave me this to show you. It's the $1 they left him." And he still owed the note. Every head in that hall turned to where Emmett Pruitt sat. And Emmett stood up. Slow, a ruined man, his hat in his 2 hands. He looked around at his neighbors, at the faces that had wondered all year what had broke him, and he said the thing out loud at last. "They took it all," he said. His voice shook and then steadied. "Nell and me, we near lost the ground over it. I was too ashamed to say. I let you all think it was just the dry." He swallowed. "It wasn't just the dry. It was them. Don't sign it. For God's sake, don't sign what I signed." He sat down. Nell took his hand, and the room came apart around Royce Tolliver. "Now hold on," he said, louder. "One farm, one bad, that's a hardship. Sure, nobody wants. But you can't hang a whole company on. You needn't hang it on one farm," Ada said. She took out the letter from Dodge. "This," she said, "is from Mr. Alderton, the county attorney. I wrote and asked him plain whether that clause was good law." She unfolded it. "I'll read you what a lawyer says. Not a schoolteacher. A lawyer." And she read it to them, the term not conspicuously disclosed as the statute required, and in his opinion not enforceable in any court in Kansas that read it. She let that land. Then she read them the rest. "And this," she said. Halloran Seed and Grain ran a contract identical in all material respects through Greer County last season. She looked up. The same paper. The same clause. The same dollar, a whole county, the year before. It isn't Mr. Tolliver's idea, neighbors. It's the company's trade. They do it wherever the ground's dry and the men are desperate, and they wrote it down often enough that the county attorneys got it in a file. Tolliver's face had gone the color of tallow. He reached for his stack of contracts to gather them, and Silas Kern's voice came across the hall like a dropped board. "Leave the papers, Royce." Tolliver looked up. And he saw what the room had become. The men on the benches were on their feet now, all of them, and there was no laughing in these faces, none of the uneasy chuckle that had let him work them at the feed store. Between him and the door stood a wall of them. Farmers, the same men who'd been an hour from signing. They didn't say a word. They didn't have to. They just stood there, shoulder to shoulder, and let him understand that he wasn't going anywhere with those papers in his hand. "You're making a serious mistake," Tolliver tried. It came out thin. Nobody moved to let him pass. Silas Kern stood up heavy and turned to the room. "I say we don't leave one of these to be signed by some fella who wasn't here tonight," he said. "I say they go in the stove." All that show of hands. Hands went up across the hall like wheat before wind, every hand, all of them. Kern gathered the stack himself, Tolliver's neat squared stack, and Emmett Pruitt opened the door of the Grange stove where a low fire burned against the cold. And one by one the men fed the Halloran contracts in and watched them catch. The forfeiture clause and all, curling, browning, gone to ash and a little light on their tired faces. Royce Tolliver stood at his table with his ledger and his good pen, and nothing left to sell. They let him go, in the end. There was no call to keep him. He gathered his empty case and put on his hat, and the wall of men opened just enough, and he walked out into the wind with the whole valley watching his back, and he drove his clean Ford out of Cottonwood Bend, and no one there ever saw him again. But the company wasn't done. Not quite. 2 days later, a different car came down the section road. A bigger man, older, a district man, softer in the voice than Tolliver and harder underneath. He didn't go to the Grange. He came to Ada's own door in the evening with his hat already in his hands, and he asked could he come in and speak with her a moment about the unfortunate misunderstanding. She let him in. She gave him the good chair. She said nothing while he talked. He was smooth as riverstone. The company regretted any distress. There'd been an overzealous agent, since let go. Halloran valued its good name in the farming counties, valued it dearly, and was prepared to be generous to smooth the thing over. And here he came to it, gentle as you please. There was no need for old letters and old files from other counties to go traveling about to newspapers and Grange offices, was there, where they'd only be misread and cause more upset. The company would consider it a personal kindness. And a personal kindness, he said, ought to be repaid in kind. He'd been authorized to bring, something for her trouble. For a schoolteacher's salary was a thin thing, and a woman alone had to think of her future. He set an envelope on her table. It was thick. Ada looked at it. Then she looked at him, and she smiled the way she smiled at a boy who'd handed her a wrong answer with great confidence. "You've come to buy my quiet," she said. The district man spread his hands, pained. "I've come to be neighborly." "Then be neighborly." Ada drew a sheet of paper toward her. She'd had it ready 2 days, and she took up her pen. "I'll tell you the price, since you've asked. It isn't in that envelope. Take that back." She began to write as she talked, her clean clerk's hand going across the page. Emmett Pruitt's contract, voided, in writing. His seed debt, every dollar of the 410 and whatever's been laid on since, forgiven, in writing, signed by a man with authority to sign it. That's you, I take it. Or you wouldn't be here with an envelope. Now Mrs. Merrick and every family in this valley that signed with your Mr. Tolliver gets their contract back to tear up with their own hands. In writing. And in place of it, if the company wants to keep doing business in Ford County at all, an honest agreement. Seed at a fair price, credit on fair terms, and not one line of it set smaller than the rest. She signed the bottom of her own sheet and turned it so he could read it, right side up, in the lamplight. "You'll sign this. Tonight." Here, the district man's soft face had gone still. "And if I don't," he said. "If you don't," Ada said, "then Mr. Alderton's letter and the Greer County file go to the state Grange office and to the newspaper in Dodge City, day after tomorrow, in Monday's Post." Both counties. The clause, the dollar, the whole pattern of it, printed where every farmer in the state can read it over his breakfast. She folded her hands. "You came here afraid of exactly that. That's why you came at all. So we both know which way this goes." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind. Then the district man let out a breath, and something in him gave, and he reached slow into his coat for his own pen. Because he could count. A settlement with one schoolteacher in one small county was cheap. The Halloran Seed and Grain Company's trade, laid out in a newspaper in the county attorney's own words, county after county, that was ruin. He'd been sent to pay the smaller price, and here it was, and he paid it. He signed it at a child's desk she pulled out for him. The little seat and the little top. A grown man in a good coat bent over it, writing his name to give a valley back its crops. Ada watched him do it. She did not gloat. She only made sure the ink was dry before she let him carry his thick envelope back out to his car, unopened, and drive away. Halloran never sold another sack of seed in Ford County. The Grange saw to that, barred from the floor, the name struck off. And Royce Tolliver, they heard later, lost the route and the whole county's commission he'd been so sure of, and drifted off wherever such men drift. That was the spring of 1934. Now let me tell you about the harvest after. It was the autumn of 1935, and the rain that year came just enough. Not a flood of it. Ford County doesn't get floods of anything but dust. But enough. Behind the schoolhouse, the wheat came up thin and honest and gold, a real crop, the first in 4 years, and when the wind moved over it, the whole field leaned and shone like something breathing. Emmett Pruitt was back on his own ground. He and Nell had kept the place, the debt gone, forgiven in writing, the way Ada had made them write it. And I've heard that Emmett stood at the edge of his own wheat that fall and took his hat off, and Nell came and stood with him, and neither one of them said a thing for a long while. They didn't need to. The dollar bill they'd been left, Nell had framed it, hung it in the kitchen, to remember. They say Royce Tolliver sells insurance now, up in Wichita. I don't doubt he's good at it. The cooperative came in the year after all that. A fair seed agreement, farmers together, no company man and no clean Ford. The terms written plain and large so any tired man could read them at the end of a long day. And when it came time to put it before the Grange, they might have had the chairman read it, or a banker, or any grown man with a good voice. Ada Merrick had a better idea. She had a girl stand up. Ruth, 12 years old that fall, one of the 40. The very child who'd first come to Ada a year and a half before and said there was a seed man saying things that didn't sound right. Ada put her own father's reading glass into that girl's hand. The brass rim, the thick lens, the scratch at the one edge. And Ruth stood up in front of the whole valley, at the Grange, and she read the new agreement aloud, line by line, slow and clear, holding the glass to the page the way she'd been taught, reading all the way down to the very bottom, where nothing hid anymore. The men listened to a 12-year-old read them their own honest bargain, and not one of them thought it strange. That's the whole of it. A seed company came to a dry county with salvation printed big and ruin printed small, and they'd have carried off a whole valley's crop for $1 a farm, and no one need ever have known. But they hadn't counted the schoolteacher. They'd looked at Ada Merrick and seen a woman who taught babies their letters, and they never once thought to ask what she'd read before the primers. The smallest print is where they hide the theft. It always has been. So teach your children to read, and teach them to read all the way to the bottom of the page. If this story found you tonight, do me one kindness. Tell me the name of the town you're watching from. I'd like to see how far it travels.